Hello and welcome to another episode of The Art of Protection, where the author and I discuss all things related to coast protection, utilising designated, incidental and counterintelligence. In this episode, I asked Michael about the relevant legislation. Because he has a law degree, it does go into quite some depth. I hope you enjoy. So welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm here with Michael, obviously, and we're talking about his third book, which is The Art of Protection. And today we're going to be obviously discussing a few of the chapters. So the first one we're going to go into is the if I can say it, legislation of law.
No, just legislate, just law or legislation.
Because also legislation, you can tell that this is not my expertise, but I've learned a lot as we go on.
We might learn more today. We'll see.
Yeah, exactly. But I need to learn the importance of law, as does everyone. But start us off, why is law so important in the industry that you're in?
I honestly think it's important for any industry. People, I don't know if it's a British thing, but people tend to sort of assume they know more about the law than they actually do. It's interesting because in the US, they learn quite a bit about law in sort of secondary education or elementary education, as they call it. But I think in our industry specifically, it's quite legally sensitive. So we have scenarios whereby force may be applied or may be necessary. So, understanding the importance of reasonable use of force, what operatives can and can't do. You'll always hear horror stories about door supervisors kind of taking it too far, whether it be the use of force or, the confiscation of items and things like that, assuming that they have more powers than the average citizen, and they do not. I see things probably because of the industry I'm in on my Instagram reels and all those kinds of things. I see just continuous videos of inappropriate behavior or arguably illegal behavior by operatives, whether it's close protection or door supervision or whatever it is. And that's not just in the UK, it's globally. The difficulty is understanding the kind of differences between one jurisdiction to another, because if the operative is traveling, they need to be quite clear on what the legal boundaries are. There are examples where celebrities travel with their security, which we touched upon in yesterday's episode. But I'll give you an example, there was a situation where I think it was Justin Bieber had traveled to the UK with either one of he's Canadian, so it was either with one of his Canadian or American bodyguards. I'm going to assume they're American because they, in the US, tend to have more authority, and I think their license does permit them to have slightly more rights in terms of using force as when necessary than we do in the UK.
Yeah.
And that guy got himself into a sticky situation because he assumed he had more powers than he did, and the paparazzi very quickly let him know.
I remember this story.
Yeah, that he didn't, and there was a sort of standoff, as it were, and the close protection guy was embarrassed as a result of it. I think because the paparazzis tend to know, like paps tend to know the sort of ins and outs of what they can do, how far they can go. Some of them will go beyond and commit an offence, but that is what it is. But they tend to know what buttons they can push in order to get more of a reaction from either the person they're trying to get photographs off or the security team as well. But those are just some minor examples as to why it's important. I think ensuring that you're operating within the boundaries of the law is critical in any job as well. But for us, like I say, there's a lot of legal sensitivities, and I think it's critical. Not critical, but I do think it's really important for people to know. Don't need to be a lawyer, but understand, and from time to time, as part of the continuous professional development, review the law, what you can and can't do.
So how did then, in your book, and in your training course, how did you decide which aspects of the law to go for? Because obviously the law is very vast, it's very big. Like, how did you narrow it down and focus on certain ones that you want to involve?
So the criteria set up by the government, as with most things with a training program. So you have to kind of ensure that the learners are on board and fully knowledgeable in certain areas. So the use of force is a big one that I mentioned. The licensing rules, what they can and can't do with their new license if they get it. But also I like to kind of go a bit further. And what I tried to do is give an introduction to law. I have to be careful because I don't teach anymore, but when I do deliver training programs, you have to look and sort of judge and assess the room. And when it comes to legislation, because it's quite in depth, people kind of tend to get a bit, sleepy and a bit bored. And other people are really, really interested. But what I tried to do, and I tried to do it in the book, is get people to understand that there are different types of law around the world. There's largely there's common law, legal systems and a civil law legal system. And if they can understand the both and the nuances between the two, they don't have to understand every piece of legislation around the world. That would be ridiculous. Even, like I said, even lawyers don't understand that or know that. So, kind of getting your head around how different legal systems work, and that there are mainly two, then they will be able to kind of apply that knowledge as best they can and as reasonably as they can, as and when they travel. So just to give a very, very brief example, the common law legal system means that whilst there are parliamentary statutes and parliamentary acts set out by, obviously, Parliament, then as time progresses, if a judge has a case before them that the Parliamentary Act doesn't directly apply to, they then have to interpret it as best they can. So there's a process they have to go through. They first have to refer to a book called Hansard, which is literally a transcript of what was discussed in Parliament, to try for the judge to try and understand what the intentions were of Parliament at that time. So the law could be 300 years old, or it could be 2 years old. If they can't apply in an appropriate way, what they will then do is sort of create law by way of common law, so that they will basically assess it on the case before them and make a judgment accordingly, whilst applying the law as far as they reasonably can. So that then becomes case law or common law, and then that will then be held up in future cases. So, and there's a hierarchy of sort of courts as well, which impacts its how far it can be challenged. So if it's upheld by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, for example, then it can't be challenged any further than that. But if it's a lower court, then that piece of civil law legislation, as it were, can be challenged by someone on an appeal case. But I'm going a bit far now, but the reason I'm trying to sort of highlight this fact is that what people might do when they're researching law is look only at what parliamentary acts exist. So if they were going to Canada, for example, they'll go, okay, what can and can't I do in terms of using force? But what they will quickly find actually is that there have been cases that have sort of not changed the law, but they've allowed the law to evolve. And the reason this is valuable is because it allows us as a country to sort of not manipulate, but allow the law to evolve in accordance with social adjustments and adjustments that just evolve as a nature of human civilization progressing. So yes, it might have been a law that was written 200 years ago, and it might still stand, but there may be little nuances that they need to understand that are applicable to them based on case law that have come about as a result of historical cases. So the fact that they will then know that once they've done the course or read a book like that, then they will kind of be able to apply that in the future. If it's Europe or a civil law sort of country, then it's pretty much codified. It is, you can do this and you can't do that. So
Yeah.
there are going to be different cases, but like I say, for me, my view is understanding the the boundaries, the legal boundaries in which you can operate and which you can't operate is, I think, really, really, really important.
And what would you say the most common legal mistakes professionals are making in these sectors?
I think, I don't know, with close protection, there's probably a misunderstanding with regards to the use of force. So I've referenced it a couple of times now, but I genuinely think that is probably the most commonly misunderstood piece of legislation. Again, the examples given in the book, because it is so important, there are historical cases where in the UK and probably Australia, Canada, and all other Commonwealth countries that still use a common law legal system, is that you've got to understand, was the use of force necessary? That's one. And was it proportionate? The example we always gave on a course is, if you get attacked by a little old woman and she's got her walking stick and she's knocking you on the legs, and you, I don't know, as a 30-year-old 6'4" man, punch her in the face, was that appropriate and was it necessary and was it required? Probably not. On the other hand, if it's someone of a similar size and they're attacking your principal with a weapon, then of course you could probably justify a response physically, based on that, based on those circumstances. I think, like I said about door supervisors before, I do think there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what powers they have when it comes to confiscation of goods, searching, and things like that. So people got to be careful so as not to break the law, and especially now social media and the way people sort of phone in your face, and
it makes it 10 times worse.
It does, yeah. And even the police, you see it with police officers, primarily in the UK and London and everywhere else.
TikTok is all over now with I see it all the time. Like anything that goes on is literally straight on there.
I know. And you've got these young kids now, they're taking videos of police officers like, what's your badge number? Good boy, walking away. It's like, I shouldn't be allowed. But what I do see is a lot of police officers making mistakes. They tend to I don't know how to phrase it really, because, you know, and I don't want to slam police officers, obviously, because they do a great job, generally speaking. But and they do it in the US as well. They tend to overstate their authority.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're like, ID, like, don't need to give ID. Whether that needs to be changed, I don't know.
It's a compliment. I always get ID'd. But
Yeah, if you get an ID for your age, I mean,
10 years older than I should be for an ID.
I used to get ID'd until I was in my sort of early 30s, believe it or not. And then COVID happened and I just started aging really badly. But no, like I said, I think it's people that should know what they can and can't do, and they don't. And largely, especially because of social media, they end up embarrassed.
Yeah.
And therefore their authority is just kind of, and any kind of assertiveness they had has just disappeared and dissipated. So they no longer have that position. And yeah, it's just embarrassing, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So you talk about some case studies in the book. Is there any case studies that you found quite surprising when you were doing your research? Yeah, legal case studies. Or any surprising things that you discovered?
I mean, you know, in British law, because the country's nearly 1,000 years old, there's always going to be legal situations and pieces of legislation that are bizarre, that are just left in there. In Commonwealth countries where there's parliaments and this legislatures like that, repealing legislation is quite a lengthy process. So what tends to happen is, rather than repeal an act of law, it's actually repealing an act of law. Or sorry, beg your pardon. Repealing an act of parliament is actually longer and longer than creating law and having it signed by the monarch. So it's largely overwritten in one way or another by a sort of subsequent piece of legislation. So you will get, when I did my law degree, there were pieces of legislation in there that were just bizarre. It's still it's still technically legal for an Englishman to kill a Welshman in a marketplace.
Yeah. Does everyone on your course have to do a law degree?
No. Law degree is going to take a minimum of 3 years.
Yeah.
In full-time education, and you can only do it once you have a certain amount of A levels or equivalent. So no, I mean, when we get people leave the police or leave the armed forces, we wouldn't even expect them to have A levels necessarily. So they don't have to. No, there's no way. My understanding, though, is in the U.S. Secret Service, who are responsible for protecting the POTUS, the President of the United States, they have to have a degree minimum. It's not necessarily in law, but a lot of them do have law degrees. So they are to some extent beyond and above the law over there, because it's a slightly different system. But no, when we have people on our course, we don't expect them to have GCSEs. Yeah. They have to do an entry test, which is not. We have an interview process. Obviously, we have a sort of application and interview process. We're the only company in the world that has that. In terms of doing attending the program, there's different governments around the world, the Australian, the UAE, and the UK. They have their own sort of guidelines as to what the minimum sort of standards are. So there's a level 1 English reading and writing and speaking test that they must pass. And I think that's pretty much it from what I recall in the UK. So here it will be something similar. And in Australia, it's almost identical to what we have in the UK. So, yeah, no, look, a degree we wouldn't expect. I mean, it's surprising if we have someone who has a degree and they come on our course. It's unusual, but it does happen. But no, they don't have to have a law degree.
So, how would you say that someone without a law background can keep up with the laws and regulations going into the industry?
So, we always encourage something called continuous professional development (CPD), which would involve things like medical training. So, every so often they should renew their medical training or endeavor to attend a different medical training program so as to keep up with it. For example, they might do a pediatric training program if they're working with a family. They might do something that's specific to gunshot wounds if they're working in or with a family who have had a threat as such where gunshot may occur. So things like that. So that's general continuous professional development. If they practice martial arts and continue to do so, if they want to learn a language, which we spoke about before, then they might wish to do that. With regards to the law, what I try to do is give a basis understanding so as to enable them to research the law in the future. We actually have a brief exercise on the course as well, whereby they have to kind of apply the law in a specific way, just so we know definitively that they've understood what has been delivered throughout the program. But yeah, in answer the short answer to your question is continuous professional development. If a new piece of legislation comes out, you should be aware of it. And they're starting to do top-up training. Well, they've been doing top-up training in the UK now for a while. So the idea behind top-up training is that a new piece of legislation is pushed upon the learners, and they can only renew their license once they have that. So that's probably a good thing. But yeah, I think, knowing, understanding, and kind of keeping on top of things in that way, in their own way, off their own back.
And would you say, you've said that like if you're working in certain areas, if you work, like go and do, say, whatever you just said about a family, that you can go and focus on certain things, would you say it's different for every person? If you were to say, if you were going to focus on one part of law,
yeah,
every individual would be different with who they're working with.
Yeah.
Or would you recommend a certain area of the law to focus on?
No, I think that's a good question. I don't think there's a real answer for that, because it's hard to. Well, the criminal law is the things that's really going to get you into trouble, right?
Yeah.
So if criminal law will involve a multitude of things, and we can't really discuss in one pod. I mean, it would take months, really. But it's the things that enable the close protection operative to work and operate in a way that they don't break the law in a criminal way. So, for example, use of force, use of weapons, understanding what equipment they can and can't use legally, perhaps. If it's, there's this big misconception about signal jammers, for example. They're a good tool to have if you want to mitigate the risk of being covertly monitored within an environment like a room or a boardroom. So that, if you were to use that in a jurisdiction where it was illegal, then that would be criminal law. You'd be committing a criminal offense. If, for example, if you're working in more of a corporate setting, perhaps with a CEO of a large organization, then you might want to, and you don't need to do this, you should be focused on priority number one, which is preservation of human life. But if you kind of have the opportunity to go beyond that, then understanding the sort of ins and outs of civil law might be beneficial as well. So things like, understanding the contracts that you're getting involved with. The contract between yourself and the company that you're working for, or if you're working directly for the principal and there's a contract in place, understanding that is beneficial rather than relying on a lawyer. Having said that, though, to be honest, that is pretty complex. Understanding contract law is not it's not an easy thing to do. With the help of AI, you can kind of interpret it better, but I would cautiously suggest that, with regards to the law, understand the basics. CPD every now and again, if you're interested in the law, listen to a few podcasts here and there that's relevant to your jurisdiction. But I wouldn't honestly say go beyond that, because I think you're kind of steering into a direction then that is away from what should be priority number 1, 2, and 3. And I think law is important, but it's not free.
Yeah, for sure. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us on this episode discussing the book, The Art of Protection, and we look forward to you joining us again next time.